Right, so we've already gotten pretty far, but the next thing that I want to create are these little boxes. These boxes that contain an icon and also a phone number or an email address, whatever it is that you want to show. Now, you can use an image asset as an icon, but it's nowhere near as adaptable as simply using an icon widget. And I want to show you how this works. If we collapse both of our text widgets and our circle avatar, then we can see that in our column, we currently have three things: our circle avatar, our text, which is our name, and finally the job title that we have here. So I'm going to go ahead and add another child, and this is going to be a container. Now, inside this container, the only child that it's going to have is a row. And very often when you're creating user interfaces in Flutter, you'll find yourself embedding rows inside columns or columns inside rows. And this gives you that kind of grid layout pattern that makes your layout really flexible. We're going to have a fourth child, which is going to be a row. And this row is going to have a whole bunch of children, including an icon. Now, an icon is a class that is drawn instead of being shown. So for an image, it's simply displayed as is. But for an icon, it's actually drawing all of the sides and the edges onto the screen. What this allows you to do is you can, on the fly, for example, change the color of the icon or the size of the icon. And it's so much more flexible than simply just using an image. And by using the material.dart package from Flutter, you already have access to a whole bunch of icons that Google made. So if you take a look at the documentation for the icons class, icons with an S, you can see that you have all of these icons at your fingertips, and they come from the material design icons. So these are icons that designers at Google actually created so that you can have a consistent theme across apps that are built with the material design look. The way that I prefer to browse icons is actually using a tool called materialpalette.com. And not only is this really good for coming up with really intelligent, beautiful color palettes. So for example, on the main page, if you select two colors that you quite like, for example, teal and say yellow, then it'll automatically generate you a 8-color color palette, even complete with an accent tone. And you can see it looks really, really nice straight up from the get-go. And it also has the colors that we've been using so far and gives you their names all in one place. And if you click on them, it'll show you all the various shades that you can tap into. There's also a third tab, which are the icons. And it's a really easily searchable place where you can say, let's look for an add icon. And it shows you, here are all the ones that you could possibly use. And when you find one of them, you can see it has a name, right? This one's called add_shopping cart. So I can simply go into my Flutter app and write icons, which is the name of the class that supports material design icons, .add shopping cart. And now, almost immediately, you can see that I can add that icon that I found on here to my app, which is brilliant if you don't want to spend a lot of time finding or creating or paying for these design resources. Now, I mentioned that icons are better than images because they're drawn on the fly. So let me show you what you can do with these icons that you can't do with images. I can, for example, turn that icon into a much larger icon by simply changing its size property. So let's make it 100. And you can see that almost immediately, my icon becomes super large and the lines get thicker and it scales until infinity. So if I change this to 1,000, you'll see that it won't pixelate because it's actually just drawn. All that happens is that it goes off the screen and you get these yellow bars as a warning to tell you that there's parts of your content that's not visible to the user. It's completely off the screen. But you can see that this icon doesn't become pixelated. Whereas if I did that to my image up here, so let's say I make that circle avatar 1000 in its radius, then you can see that my picture becomes a little bit pixelated. And let's go a little bit more extreme. Let's add another 0 to that. And now it's completely not interpretable. I can't really tell what that is anymore, even though I know it's hair. This is the reason why icons are much better, because they're vectors and you can even change their color on the fly. Let's change the color of my icon to that teal color that we've been using. Let's hit save, and you can see it now blurs into the background. But if I change that into a 900 shade and hit save, then you'll see it's become a much darker teal, and now it's completely visible. So you can change the color of it, you can change the size of it, you can do all sorts of things with these icons that you can't do with images. And this is why they're really, really useful inside your app. All right, so the icon that we actually want here is the one called phone. And this one gives us that little phone icon that we can put next to some piece of text. So in addition to the icon, I'm also going to have some text. And this is simply going to be, say, a phone number. So +44 123 456 789, for example. And then I'm going to style up my text because at the moment it looks a bit boring. So I'm going to give it a text style. And this is going to have a color, which is going to be a dark teal color. So colors.teal.shade 900. And then it's going to have a font family of the same one that we've been using, which is Source Sans Pro. And we're going to change the font size to 20 points. And let's hit save and see what that looks like. All right, so that looks pretty nice, but it'd be nice if there was a little bit of space between the icon and the text, right? Well, we know that we are inside a row, and the way that we can easily add space between our children in our rows is by adding a sized box. So we're going to add a sized box, and we're going to give it some dimension in the horizontal axis, right? Because we're in a row, so it's going to go from left to right. So we'll give it a width. And let's give it a width of maybe 10 points, and that should be enough to separate those out a little bit, make it look just that bit nicer. So finally, I'm going to give my container a color just so that it will show up as a separate piece of information from the rest of my widgets. So let's give this a color of white, and let's hit save. And now I have to change my icon back into teal so that it's visible. And I can make it come away from the edges of the screen a little bit by adding margin. So a lot of the widgets inside Flutter will have margin or padding as properties that you can change. And they all work exactly the same way as we saw earlier with the columns and the rows. We use edge insets, and I'm going to add edge insets only that are different for the top and bottom and also left and right. So I'm going to use symmetric, and I'm going to say that the vertical sides, so the top and bottom, are going to have 10 points of margin, and the horizontal is going to have 25 points of margin. Now you can see that our container comes away a little bit from the edges, and it looks just a little bit better. And our container also has padding. So let's add maybe 10 pixels of padding to all four sides. And now we have our little card, right? As a challenge, I want you to create the other container, the one where you have your email address and an email icon. So I want to challenge you to use the Flutter documentation and also what you learned in this lesson to create that second card. Pause the video and give that a go now. Okay, so we know that we need another container, right? It's pretty much the same as this one. So let's find out where our container ends. It's right about here. And let's go ahead and collapse it. And then we're going to add another container underneath it. And this one is also going to have the same amount of padding. So that was edge insets all with 10 points. And then it's going to have a margin of symmetric margin with 10 on the vertical and 25 on the horizontal. And finally, it's going to have some content. And the content is going to be under the child property. And it's going to be a row that we want to create. The row is going to have some children. And these children include an icon that comes from the icons class. And you can either scroll through this to find an icon that looks right. But in this case, it's going to be email. Or you can take a look at the websites that we spoke about earlier on. Now that I have my email icon in there, I'm going to change the styling of that icon to make it look a bit more like the other one. So I have to change its color to teal. And then I get to add my text, which can really say anything you want it to. But in my case, I'm going to add maybe an email. Let's say angela@email.com. And then I'm going to change its style to have a text style. And maybe we'll go for a font size of 20 to match with the other one. A color of teal 900. And the font family is, of course, also going to be Source Sans Pro. And let's hit save and let's see if we get what we wanted. Okay, so we can see that the icon has disappeared, so it's the same color as the background. We've got our text formatted in the same way as the previous one. And all we have to do now is to give our container a white background. And it should show up underneath the other one and show us what else is missing. So the only thing that looks odd to me here is just a little bit of space between the icon and the text. So to do that, we have to add our sized box with a width, and that was going to be 10. And now if we hit save, then it's starting to look pretty good. In the next lesson, we're going to finalize this app and we're going to make these info sections a little bit nicer looking using a Flutter widget called Card. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now we can see that our design is really coming together and it's looking already pretty nice. But there's just a few things that look a little bit different for our info sections here compared to what we initially wanted. And these are really subtle things, like maybe a little bit of rounding of the corners or a little bit of shadow under the white part to make it feel like it's popping out of the page a little bit. So we can either try and customize what we have to make it look like this, or we can simply use a pre-built widget class called Card. And you might have seen this in a lot of the apps that you use from day to day, especially the ones from Google. This is a very, very subtly shadowed rectangle, and it has a small curve to all four edges, and it has a decent amount of padding so the content's centered on the card. And we can create this really, really simply by using the Card widget. Let's swap out our containers for a card widget instead. And the first thing that you'll notice is that we have some red lines. And that's because the card widget doesn't actually have a padding property. So let's go ahead and delete the padding that we've set for both of those. But other than the padding, everything else is perfectly valid. Cards have a margin that you can set. It has a child that can contain items inside here. And if I hit save right now, you can see that our info sections automatically start looking like cards. Now, the only problem is that our cards don't have any padding. So what can we do when we have a widget that doesn't actually have a property that we want to change? Because padding doesn't exist for card. But if you look through the Flutter documentation, you might come across something called the padding class. And this is a widget that can be added as a parent to any other widget, and it'll give it some padding. And this is how you might use it. So you could have a padding widget as the parent to a card widget, and now you end up with some padding around it. Now, the way that you use padding is quite interesting. Let's go ahead and add our padding. And we're going to do it around our row because we're going to pad out our row inside our card. So I'm going to select or put my cursor on the row widget, and I'm going to hold down Option or Alt and hit Enter to pull up the Intention Actions menu. And I'm going to select Wrap with New Widget. And that new widget is, of course, going to be padding. And padding, of course, has a padding property, and we're going to set it to Edge Insets All with 25 points of padding. Now you can see that we have all this massive space around our row. So the padding goes around its child. It's almost like we're adding a soft blanket around whichever widget it is that we've wrapped our padding. In our case, that's our row. And so the row now exists inside a 25-point padding. Now, what would you think would have happened had we put our padding around our card instead? Well, in that case, we can remove our widget from our row and we can add it to our card, and you can see that adding padding around widgets is such a common action that you can actually select it in this menu already. And you can select that and it comes pre-built with a certain amount of padding. So let's change that to 25. And you can see that when the padding goes around the card, it doesn't actually achieve what it is that we wanted, which is to get a slightly larger card with a bit of space between the edges of the card and the actual content. But in this case, what's actually happened is the padding has gone around our card, and it almost looks like we've added margins around our card. It's important to remember that when you're adding padding, the child of the padding widget is going to get a blanket essentially wrapped around it and separated from everything else. I'm going to go ahead and delete that padding. And I want to show you that not only can we use the card widget to make our lives easier, we can even get rid of our row widget by using something that's used very commonly with cards in Flutter. And it's used so commonly that they even mention it in the documentation. Whenever you're looking at documentation on the Flutter website, there's usually a section called See Also. And this very helpfully points you towards other widgets that are used really commonly with this widget. And here it points to something called a list tile. And this displays icons and text in a card. Well, that sounds pretty much like what we need, right? So let's click on it and see what it does. This is a single fixed height row that typically contains some text as well as a leading or trailing icon. So that sounds like a much more convenient way of implementing all of this. Instead of having our row, we're going to use this list tile instead. So I'm going to cut the row out and I'm going to paste it at the bottom for reference. And inside my card, as a child, I'm going to add a list tile. And you can see that list tiles have a number of properties. The leading area, which is on the left of that row, the title, which is a bit of text that we could put. It could also have a subtitle, and finally a trailing icon. Let's add our list tile and let's give it a leading widget, which is going to be our icon. So I'm going to take all of my icon and I'm going to paste it inside here. So let's get rid of that duplicate comma. And now we can add a title to our list tile. And that title is, of course, going to be our text. So from the bottom part of our text to the top, I'm going to paste that inside here. And now we have a list tile and a piece of text, and we can delete the rest of this. So that's a lot shorter. If you hit save and you take a look at the result, you can see that it's already got a bit of space between the leading icon and the title. And we've got a little bit of padding around our list tile, and it looks pretty great already. So as a challenge, try and reformat the other list tile so that it does exactly the same thing, and have a look through the documentation for the list tile to see what other things you can customize about it. The only other thing that we need to change here is this card. And this card currently has a row in it, which we're going to remove. So we're going to find the row comment and cut out this row, paste it at the bottom in case we need it. And then we're going to add a list tile as the child. And it's going to have a leading widget, which is going to be our icon. So icon, let's put that in here. And delete the extra comma. And then it's also going to have a title, which is going to be our text widget here. And let's paste that in there. Now we can delete all of this and we can hit save. Cards by default come with a white color. So we can delete this color property without it changing anything about our card. And you can see that we now have this vastly simplified code because we're able to use pre-built widgets that conform to the material design principles. And all we had to do is to figure out which widget to use and how we want to set its properties. And through this, we're able to customize the appearance of these widgets to our liking. All that we have to do now is to get our column to be centered. So do you still remember how to do that? See if you can challenge yourself to find that out from the column documentation. See if you can figure out how to center our content for our column. Let's head over to our column class, and you might already remember this from our previous lessons on the column, but one of the most important things that you can set is the cross-axis alignment and the main axis alignment. So the main axis determines how the children should be placed along the main axis, which in the case of a column is of course along this axis. So that is the one that we want to make centered. So let's find out where we created our column, and then right underneath it, we're going to add our main axis alignment, and we're going to change it to center. And now all of our items will get pushed right into the middle, and it starts looking a lot more like a little business card. So now the final thing that we need to add is a little line between this section and this section to separate it. And to do that, we're going to add a sized box, because this is a really easy way of adding something with a fixed height inside our column. And I'm going to give it a height of just 20 points. And then I'm going to give it a child. And the child is going to be our horizontal line. So in web design, you have something called the horizontal rule, which creates a single horizontal line. But in Flutter, we have something called a divider. And the divider class simply puts a 1 pixel thick horizontal line onto our screen. Let's add that as the child. And let's change its color to maybe a nice light teal color. And you can see that we now have this line going from edge to edge. Now, what if we want it to be just a little bit shorter? Well, we can actually change the size of our sized box, because at the moment its width is as wide as the screen. What if we change the width instead to 150 pixels? Now our line gets just a little bit shorter, and it's just enough to separate our top group and our bottom group. So in this module, we explored a number of widgets, including layout widgets such as containers, columns, and rows, but also customizable widgets such as a circle avatar or the card widget or a list tile. And we looked at how we can use the documentation to see what properties of these widgets we can set and customize them to our liking. Finally, we also learned about how to use custom fonts and icons to make our design come to life. So now it's truly your time to update this app, to make it your own. So personalize it for yourself. Change it to have your details or your job description or whatever it is that you want to change about this. And once you're done, be sure to share it with the community and everybody else who's taking the course along with you using the hashtag FlutterBrew. And I look forward to seeing all of your amazing creations. So that's all from me for this module. I'll see you on the next one.